Before you think love can't reach someone who pulls away, understand this. Avoidant people don't run from love. They run from what love has felt like to them in the past. And the moment you stop chasing them with pressure and start meeting them with calmness, boundaries, and emotional depth, something unexpected happens. The same person who once distanced themselves begins to feel something they didn't plan for: safety inside closeness, curiosity instead of fear, and a desire to stay where they used to escape from. Before you decide an avoidant person is difficult to understand, difficult to keep close, or someone you can never truly reach, it's important to hear something clearly. They are not wired to respond to connection in the same way most people are. More attention doesn't automatically draw them in, more effort doesn't guarantee closeness, and more emotional intensity often does the opposite. It creates distance instead of attraction. This is where many connections fail before they even have a chance to develop, because the usual logic of love stops working here. What actually reaches someone with avoidant tendencies is not loud affection or constant proving. It is not perfection, and it is not chasing harder until they finally give in. What truly gets through is something far more subtle: psychological safety wrapped in emotional space. A sense that closeness is possible without control, and connection can exist without pressure. Once you begin to understand that, everything about their behavior starts to make sense in a new way. Most people assume love works the same for everyone. Be more available, be more expressive, be more consistent, and eventually you will be chosen. But for someone who is protective of their emotional space, those exact behaviors can feel overwhelming. Too much reassurance can feel suspicious. Constant contact can feel suffocating. Fast emotional escalation can feel like being pulled into something they haven't agreed to yet. So even when your intentions are warm, the experience on their side can feel like pressure instead of comfort. That is why confusion often shows up. You give more, you care more, you invest more, and yet they pull back. The truth is, they are not responding to your love itself, but to how safe that love feels inside their internal world. They are not only asking if they like you, they are also asking whether they can stay connected to themselves while being close to you. Whether they can breathe, think, and remain emotionally intact without feeling consumed. That hidden evaluation is always running underneath the surface. What begins to open them up is an energy that communicates care without control. A presence that says, "I'm here, I value you, but I'm not here to take over your emotional world." That combination is rare, and because it is rare, it stands out. It doesn't rely on words alone. It is felt through behavior, consistency, and emotional steadiness. One of the strongest signals of this kind of energy is emotional independence. When you are genuinely grounded in your own life, your routines, your goals, your identity, you become far more compelling to someone who fears emotional entanglement. Not because you are distant, but because you are stable. You are not waiting to be completed. You are not collapsing when space appears between you. You can miss them without losing yourself in the process. That difference changes everything. It quietly tells them that connection with you will not turn into obligation or emotional dependence. Instead, it offers something they rarely expect: closeness that does not erase individuality, and that is where interest begins to deepen in a more organic way. Alongside emotional independence, there is another element that plays a powerful role: mystery and unpredictability. Not in a manipulative or artificial sense, but in the natural way that comes from having a full, self-directed life. People with avoidant patterns tend to observe carefully. They look for predictability so they can manage emotional risk. When everything about a person is immediately exposed, every thought, every feeling, every detail, they may feel less curiosity and more emotional distance because there is nothing left to explore. But when someone unfolds gradually, when their life has layers that aren't instantly accessible, something shifts internally. Attention increases, thoughts linger. Curiosity starts to build on its own. They begin to mentally engage before they emotionally commit. This is not about playing games or withholding authenticity. It is about not reducing yourself to instant access. Depth naturally creates intrigue, and intrigue pulls them in without force. Then there is one more dynamic that often becomes decisive: how you handle emotional tension. Avoidant individuals typically expect conflict to escalate into emotional overwhelm. They anticipate pressure, blame, intensity, or situations where they feel trapped in reaction. Because of that expectation, they often begin distancing themselves even before a disagreement fully unfolds. But when they are met with calmness instead of chaos, everything changes in real time. When you can express yourself clearly without raising emotional temperature, when you can hold your ground without aggression or desperation, it disrupts their internal prediction system. The moment no longer feels dangerous. Instead of preparing to escape, they begin to stay present. Instead of feeling cornered, they start to feel space. And in that space, something important becomes possible. Trust that closeness does not have to equal emotional loss of control. That realization is often what slowly transforms distance into genuine willingness to stay engaged, and that matters more than most people realize. Because underneath it all, avoidant individuals aren't only afraid of closeness itself. They're often afraid of what closeness turns into when emotions intensify. So when you remain composed, you are not just appearing attractive in a surface-level sense. You are communicating something far more powerful on a nervous system level. You are showing them that emotional moments don't have to end in collapse, withdrawal, or chaos. They can end in clarity. They can end in mutual understanding. They can even strengthen trust instead of destroying it. And once they actually experience that kind of emotional steadiness with you, something begins to shift internally. Their system starts registering a new possibility. Closeness doesn't automatically mean danger. Over time, that rewires how they respond. The walls don't just crack from external pressure. They start loosening from within, almost as if their own defenses begin to question whether they're still needed in the same way. Strong boundaries create a similar kind of impact, and this is where many people misunderstand the dynamic completely. There's a common belief that being endlessly agreeable, endlessly available, and endlessly accommodating is what creates connection. But for someone with avoidant tendencies, that kind of openness can feel less like comfort and more like weight. Without boundaries, love can start to feel fused too quickly, too intensely, and too invasively. But when you can calmly say no, when you can define your limits without hostility, when you can stand firm without becoming cold or reactive, the entire emotional tone of the relationship changes. Boundaries communicate self-respect. They signal emotional maturity. They show that you are not trying to disappear inside the relationship or let someone else define your sense of self. And for someone who fears being overwhelmed or emotionally engulfed, that presence of structure can actually feel safe. The truth is, avoidant individuals tend to respect what clearly respects itself. If they sense there are no limits, they may unconsciously slip into emotional passivity because nothing requires them to step up. But when they meet someone who is kind yet firm, open yet grounded, loving yet self-contained, something in them recalibrates. You are no longer just comfort. You become someone solid, someone who has shape, someone whose presence carries weight and direction. One of the most powerful turning points happens when they pull away and you remain steady. This is where the deeper pattern reveals itself. Avoidant behavior often includes distancing when emotions begin to intensify. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes automatic. Sometimes it's simply their system trying to regulate itself. In some cases, it's even a quiet form of testing, seeing what closeness costs and whether it becomes too much. If your response in that moment is panic, over-explanation, emotional chasing, or trying to pull them back through urgency, it reinforces their internal fear that connection equals pressure. But if you stay grounded, present, warm, and connected to your own life, you create an entirely different experience for them. You are not punishing them. You are not collapsing. You are simply not abandoning yourself in response to their distance. That stability speaks louder than any emotional reaction ever could. It shows them that space does not destroy connection. That separation does not automatically mean loss. And strangely enough, instead of pushing them further away, your steadiness often draws their awareness back toward you. Not because you are demanding it, but because you are no longer destabilized by their inconsistency. At that point, attraction deepens quietly. They begin to notice that you are not emotionally controlled by their fluctuations. Your center remains intact. and that creates both respect and curiosity at the same time. In many cases, this is where real attachment begins forming, not through pursuit, but through consistency under pressure. Intellectual stimulation adds another layer to this dynamic. Many avoidant individuals process emotional experiences through cognition first. They observe, analyze, and rationalize before they fully feel. So when someone engages them mentally through insight, perspective, humor, depth, or thoughtful conversation, it creates a sense of connection that feels safe rather than overwhelming. It is intimacy without forced exposure, engagement without emotional flooding, a conversation that opens doors instead of breaking them down. That's why a deep, meaningful exchange can stay in their mind far longer than an emotionally intense moment that feels chaotic or demanding. Over time, this intellectual connection often becomes the bridge to emotional openness. First, they respect your mind. Then, they trust your perception. Then slowly, they begin revealing parts of themselves they usually keep hidden, not because they are pressured, but because understanding builds gradually in a way that feels secure. Self-respect and selective availability reinforce this even further. When someone is too instantly accessible, too quickly available, or too emotionally centered on the connection, it can unintentionally reduce perceived value. Not because love is less real, but because it becomes too predictable and too easy to access. But when your life is full, your time is intentional, and your attention is given with awareness rather than impulse, something shifts in how you are perceived. Your presence starts to feel earned rather than assumed, and that sense of rarity naturally increases emotional significance. This isn't about pretending to be distant. It's about living in a way where your identity does not dissolve inside the relationship. You are present, but not empty. Connected, but not dependent. Available, but not excessive. And that balance creates a kind of attraction that feels grounded rather than chaotic. Avoidant individuals often respond strongly to that, not because they are being manipulated, but because they can sense the difference between emotional need and emotional self-possession, and that difference stays with them. Healthy vulnerability works in a similar way. Vulnerability is not the problem, it's how it is expressed. When emotions are shared in a way that carries pressure, expectation, or emotional responsibility, it can trigger withdrawal. But when feelings are expressed clearly, calmly, and without demanding a response, it becomes something entirely different. It becomes trust without entrapment, openness without emotional burden, truth without collapse. And that kind of emotional expression can be deeply disarming for someone who is used to equating vulnerability with overwhelm. It shows them that intimacy does not have to equal emotional loss of control, that someone can be honest and still self-contained. And over time, that model of connection becomes something they begin to trust more deeply. Playfulness and emotional lightness add yet another dimension. Avoidant individuals often carry a quiet, internal tension in relationships, even when they are interested. There can be an underlying expectation that closeness will eventually become heavy, demanding, or emotionally consuming. So when interactions include humor, ease, teasing, and light emotional rhythm, it interrupts that expectation. Suddenly, connection does not feel like pressure, it feels alive, it feels breathable, it feels enjoyable rather than something they have to manage or defend against. And often, a single shared laugh can do what long emotional explanations cannot. It creates safety without intensity, it builds closeness without demand. And for someone who is always partially preparing for emotional weight, that lightness can be unexpectedly powerful. Of course, depth still matters. But once a connection carries genuine joy, something shifts in how an avoidant person experiences closeness. They stop automatically associating intimacy with heaviness. Instead, they begin to realize that love can hold both honesty and ease at the same time. And that realization is not small. It changes their internal map of relationships. Because if every interaction feels emotionally loaded, they start to brace themselves. Eventually, they withdraw. But when being with you feels like relief instead of pressure, when it feels light, engaging, playful, even grounding, they remember that feeling. They return to it mentally, and over time, they begin to crave it. Not because they are being pushed, but because something about the connection feels safe to re-enter. This is where attraction becomes natural instead of forced. There is no sense of being dragged into closeness or emotionally cornered. Instead, they are being invited into an experience that actually feels good to be inside. And that distinction is powerful. Never underestimate the impact of someone who can make an avoidant person laugh while also making them feel emotionally safe in the same breath. That combination is rare, and rarity always leaves an imprint. And then there is another turning point, the one that often hits the deepest layer of all. Your ability to walk away with dignity. At first, this can sound harsh, but in reality, it is one of the most influential forces in the entire dynamic. When someone consistently remains available through inconsistency, distance, and emotional uncertainty, there is rarely urgency for change. Nothing in the system is challenged. Nothing has to evolve. But when an avoidant person realizes that your love is real enough to stay honest and strong enough to leave if the connection becomes unhealthy, that awareness creates a shift. Not panic, not manipulation, but awareness. Suddenly, your presence carries weight. You are no longer someone who will remain no matter what happens. You are someone who will choose themselves if necessary, and that changes everything. Because the question is no longer, how much distance can I take while still having them here? It becomes, am I at risk of losing something meaningful because I keep avoiding emotional responsibility? That question lands deeper than pressure ever could because it comes from respect and consequence, not emotional chasing. All of these dynamics share a single core truth. They do not activate avoidance. They soften it without compromising your self-respect. They create attraction through calmness, depth, and emotional clarity rather than pressure, urgency, or constant proof. Emotional independence shows them that love does not have to become dependency. Mystery keeps curiosity alive instead of replacing it with predictability. Calmness during conflict proves that honesty does not have to turn into chaos. Boundaries demonstrate that closeness does not erase identity. Stability during distance shows that space does not equal abandonment. Intellectual depth creates connection without emotional flooding. Selective availability communicates value. Healthy vulnerability shows truth without collapse. Playfulness introduces ease, and dignity communicates that your presence is not something that can be taken for granted. When all of that comes together, commitment stops feeling like confinement. It begins to feel like something that might actually be safe enough to choose. But these are not techniques. They are not tactics to control someone's attachment system. And they are definitely not ways to force emotional availability from someone who is unwilling. When they are performed artificially, they lose all meaning. What makes them powerful is embodiment. Because an avoidant person is never just reacting to words. They are reacting to emotional consistency, internal stability, and the overall atmosphere you bring into the connection. And when that atmosphere remains steady over time, trust begins to form in ways that are quiet but real. It is important to understand what actually pushes them away too. It is not distance alone. It is emotional pressure disguised as love. It is intensity without stability. It is need without grounding. It is self-abandonment presented as devotion. It is emotional overwhelm that turns connection into responsibility. When those patterns appear, their system does what it was trained to do. It steps back to regain safety. That is why consistency matters so much more than intensity. Not grand moments, but repeated experiences that communicate safety without control. Over time, that repetition reshapes perception. Love stops feeling like something that consumes them and starts feeling like something they can exist inside without losing themselves. But here is where many people get it wrong. Understanding avoidant dynamics is not a reason to abandon yourself in order to be chosen. It is not about shrinking, waiting, or tolerating emotional imbalance in hopes that distance will eventually turn into commitment. Because real attraction does not come from overextension. It comes from wholeness. The strongest dynamic is not created by someone who is endlessly available, endlessly patient, or endlessly proving. It is created by someone who remains grounded in their own identity while still being capable of deep connection. Someone who can say, without anger or fear, I care about you, but I will not lose myself to stay close to you. That kind of emotional integrity changes everything in the dynamic. It removes desperation, it removes ambiguity, and it reveals whether the connection is capable of existing in reality or only in inconsistency. Because the most powerful form of love is not obsession, it is self-honoring devotion, the ability to care deeply without self-erasure, to remain open without becoming dependent, to stay warm without becoming weak. And for an avoidant person, that is often what stands out the most. Not pressure, not pursuit, but emotional clarity combined with self-respect. If there is one truth that ties everything together, it is this. Avoidant individuals do not open because they are forced or cornered. They open when the experience of connection slowly becomes safer than the defenses they built to survive. And that shift never comes from control. It comes from steadiness, from emotional cleanliness, from honesty without chaos, from closeness without pressure, from a connection that does not demand self-abandonment in order to exist. That is why these dynamics matter, not because they create attachment through strategy, but because they redefine what attachment feels like in the first place. And when that new experience takes hold, even slightly, something subtle happens. The urge to run doesn't disappear instantly, but it weakens enough for curiosity to appear in its place. And sometimes, that quiet curiosity is the first real sign that something different is finally possible. In the end, nothing about this is about control, chasing, or trying to outsmart someone's attachment style. It is about understanding a deeper emotional truth. Avoidant people don't reject love itself. They reject the feeling of losing themselves inside it. And when they meet someone who is steady without being cold, open without being overwhelming, loving without being dependent, and present without self-abandonment, their entire internal experience of connection begins to shift. Love stops feeling like pressure and starts feeling like something they can actually breathe in. But the real conclusion goes even deeper than attraction. Because the strongest relationships are never built on one person overextending themselves to be chosen. They are built when both people remain whole, when closeness does not require self-erasure, when emotional honesty does not turn into chaos, when care does not come with fear. That is where everything changes. Not when you become more available, not when you try harder, but when you become grounded enough that your presence carries clarity, dignity, and peace. And in that space, something quiet but powerful happens. Avoidance softens, curiosity awakens, and for the first time, connection no longer feels like something to escape, but something that might finally be safe enough to stay in. Because in the end, the real shift was never about changing them. It was about becoming someone whose love feels like stability, not pressure, and that is what makes all the difference.